Welcome to another responsive design video. I'd like to preface this video in saying that there are going to be many ways to do what we're going to do in this video. And I'm going to cover maybe just one or two ways of doing this, and I can point you to some resources that will step you through all the ways of doing this. But this is just to say that Grid is extremely, extremely flexible in the way that you can handle things. I'm going to show you how to turn this into a multi-column layout with a header, a nav, a footer, and a series of modules in between. Now you could just say, well, I've done that before. I just used a header, a nav, and a footer, and I made two columns by floating them and clearing them and all that kind of stuff. Or I could make a content wrapper that's going to be in between the nav and the footer, and then just use flex to flex those columns, or use a grid and put some modules in there and make those the grid elements. Yeah, you could do that. But I'm going to show you how to do it with just one container and a series of grid items. So I've got 9 grid items here, and I'm going to turn them into a header, a nav, a series of columns, and a footer. All right, let's watch. So this is going to start out with something called grid column start and grid column end. This is why we made all of these style rules that we haven't used yet from 1 through 9, because we're going to establish their roles. So if you haven't done this, make these now. All right, welcome back. I'm going to go to 1 here. I'm going to go grid column start and grid column end. This is going to establish the start of a column and the end of a column. Now, in the last video, we talked about setting up the heights and widths of tracks. So we made our grid by establishing how wide and how tall each of the rows and columns are going to be. Well, in this video, what I'm going to do is, based on these tracks, I'm going to set up the grid items start and end based on the lines. Remember in the last video I said that a grid has both tracks and lines? So if we look at our web page here, you can see I've got track 1, 2, 3, and I've got line 1, which is this gap, line 2, line 3, and line 4. But they're also considered line -1 on the right side, line -2 right here, line -3, and line -4. So each line has 2 names. The first line on the left side would be 1, and then negative however many lines you have. The last one is going to be, well, however many lines you have, like 4 in this case, and -1. So let's see how we can use these lines to establish a grid item that might span across many tracks. I'm going to start this way. I'm going to go from grid column start at 1, grid column end 3. So it's going to start at line 1, end at line 3. So it should start here right before element 1, 2, 3, and span across track 2 and 1 and end at line 3. Let's see if it works. I'm going to save it, refresh it, and it did. You can see that this is now spanning across 2 tracks going from line 1 to line 3. Well, I want to turn item 1 into my header, so it's going to span across all 3 tracks. I could go 1 to 4, and it goes all the way to the end. Now, this isn't necessarily scalable or flexible, because what if the number of tracks changes in a design? And what if I always want item 1 to be the header? Well, if that's the case, I could do this. I can go 1, -1. So that means it's the first line from the end. This is the starting line. So 1 means the starting line, -1, first line from the end. And we see no change. So 1 to -1 would span the whole thing. So I've got my header here. This is going to work like my header. I'm going to turn number 2 into my nav. So my nav, I want it to stretch from 1 to -1 as well. I want it to be as wide as the page is. So 2, I'm just going to copy this, and I'm going to paste it into 2. So item 2 is also going to go from 1 to -1. It'll stretch the entire width across all my tracks. Now that's too tall. Remember when I set up those tracks and I said I wanted to have the first one be whatever, 150 pixels, and then I wanted this to be 2FR or something like that? I'm going to change that. I'm going to change this now to 1FR. There we go. Okay, let's go back here. Now we've got to analyze this and decide what we want to do. We know that number 9 is going to be our footer. We want that to be the last one. So let's set up number 9. And I want it to be the same thing, from 1 to -1. So I'll go number 9. Grid column start 1. Grid column end -1. I'll save it. I'll check it in the browser. And it did it. Wow, you might say that's really darn cool. I like that a lot. Let's see what else we can do with this. I'm going to play around with some of these things in here. What if I wanted number 3 and number 5 to go from line 1, 2, 3 to 4, 5? Let's see if that works. So that was grid item 3. It'll go from 3 to 5. Now it's not going to be row this time, or column this time. It's going to be row. Grid row start, grid row end. And I'll start at 3, and I'll go to 5. And see what it looks like. See if it does what I want it to do. Well, it's stretched, but then I've got this one left over here. I'm not sure that I'm such a fan of that. So let's play around a little bit more. I'm going to change number 5. I'm going to do the same thing here with 5. So grid row start 3, grid row end 5. All right, well, that's sitting right next to that one. That's not really where I want it. See how it kind of changed the order? I'm running into some problems now. So this is a great way of doing some things, but it's got limitations in other ways. What I want you to take away from this video is if you want to do kind of a standard layout, something that's a little simpler, actually I could fill this up. I could go with 8, have it span across 2 tracks, and I could, 8, I could go from, let's see, line 1, line 2, from line 2 to line -1. And that can fill it up. But it's showing that there are some limitations to the way this works. Line 2 to -1. And it takes up that empty space there. But it's got some limitations in the way that this works. It gets a little bit tricky when you're trying to line up the rows and columns the way you want if you've got something more modular like this. It's very easy to make, like, as you saw, a header, a nav, a footer, and then a series of regular rows and columns without any kind of spanning with rows and columns. But if you want to do it with a little bit more control, there are other ways to do that, and that's going to be working with grid areas. So anyways, this concludes the basics of working with grid. If you stopped learning about grid right here, you could make some pretty complex layouts. You could do a standard multi-column layout with a header, nav, and footer, and you could even inside of one of your divs inside the columns. You could use Flexbox to do a gallery type thing. You could even take this and roll with it and make it responsive. So you've got a lot of tools at your disposal now to make pretty powerful layouts. But from here, this is just a jumping off point. From here, you can start thinking about all the other ways of dealing with the grid. And it gets pretty deep. There are a lot of ways to set this up and a lot of different CSS properties that allow you to control where all the grid elements will end up, or all the grid items will end up. So I encourage you to take what you've learned from these and use it as a jumping off point. Maybe look for some tutorials, maybe find some other videos that go deeper into working with grid. Anyways, thanks for watching.